Louis B. Mayer stood at her graveside with flowers in his hand. He wept, or performed weeping. The distinction by that point hardly mattered. The cameras were there, the press was there, the spectacle was there. And Barbara Lamar, the woman he had worked to the edge of human endurance and then beyond it, was in the ground at 29 years old, weighing less than 90 pounds. This is where we begin. Not at her birth. Not at her first screen test. Not at the moment some talent scout told a young woman from the American West that she had a face the camera would never stop loving. We begin here, at the grave, because everything that matters about Barbara Lamar's story is visible in that single image. A powerful man, a dead woman, flowers that cost him nothing, a grief that cost him less. Louis B. Mayer called her the girl who is too beautiful. He said it like a compliment. He repeated it like a brand. He stamped it onto her image, her publicity materials, her identity. Because in 1920s Hollywood, beauty was not something a woman owned. Beauty was something the studio monetized. And Barbara Lamar was, by any measure, one of the most monetizable women the silent screen had ever produced. Dark eyes that the camera treated like open wounds. A quality of presence that made audiences lean forward in their seats without knowing why. A talent. And this is the word that history has buried, so we will exhume it and say it plainly. A breathtaking, self-generated, conquering talent that she brought to MGM not as a gift, but as a tool they could extract value from until the tool broke. The tool broke in January 1926, but here is what the studio told the newspapers. She died of overwork, exhaustion, the tragic price of devotion to her craft. They wrapped her death in the language of noble sacrifice, as if Barbara Lamar had simply loved Hollywood too much, burned too brightly, given too freely of herself. It was a beautiful story. It was also a calculated lie designed to protect the people who had watched her deteriorate in real time and sent her back to the set anyway. Barbara Lamar did not die of overwork. Barbara Lamar died of tuberculosis, a disease that was diagnosable, treatable by the medical standards of 1925, and manageable with rest, nutrition, and basic human care. She died weighing under 90 pounds. She died having worked through the advanced stages of illness because MGM's production schedules did not accommodate dying. She died while the studio that owned her contract, controlled her image, and profited from her face continued to promote her pictures, continued to exploit her name, and continued to tell the American public that she was simply tired. This was not an accident. This was lethal negligence dressed in studio publicity. To understand how this happened, how a woman of 29 with the world genuinely at her feet ended up in that coffin while Louis B. Mayer performed grief for the cameras, you need to understand three things with absolute clarity. First, Barbara Lamar was extraordinary, not in the soft, decorative way that Hollywood preferred its women to be extraordinary, but in the fierce, self-made, against all odds way that the industry spent decades trying to erase from her story. She arrived in Hollywood without connections, without money, without anyone opening doors for her. She opened them herself. She wrote. She performed. She created. She conquered an industry designed to consume women like her, and for a brief, blazing period she won. Second, MGM knew she was sick. The studio knew. The executives knew. The production managers who scheduled her shoots knew. The wardrobe department that dressed a body visibly wasting away knew. This was not a tragedy born of ignorance. This was a tragedy born of calculation. The cold corporate arithmetic that weighed Barbara Lamar's remaining productive value against the cost of slowing down, and decided the schedule mattered more than the woman. Third, what happened after she died was, in some ways, worse than what happened before. Before she died, the studio exploited her labor. After she died, they exploited her memory. They exploited her image. They exploited her orphaned son for press sympathy. They turned her death into content, which is, when you strip away the period-appropriate language, exactly what they had always done with every living, breathing, suffering part of her. Louis B. Mayer stood at her graveside with flowers in his hand. The flowers were for the cameras. The cameras were for the public. The public, who had loved Barbara Lamar with genuine devotion, deserved the truth. They received a performance instead. In the months and years that followed her death, the real story, the tuberculosis, the ignored symptoms, the schedules that did not stop, the medical care that was never provided, the financial agreements that bound her to work she was no longer physically capable of surviving. That story got buried almost as efficiently as Barbara Lamar herself. Hollywood is very good at burials. It has had a great deal of practice. What you are about to hear is not the story MGM told. It is not the story of a beautiful woman who burned too brightly and faded. It is not a tragedy without a villain. It is not a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame or the fragility of beauty or any of the other comfortable fictions the studio system constructed to avoid accountability. What you are about to hear is a prosecutorial record, evidence assembled across a century of what the studio system did to one specific woman, what it extracted from her, what it denied her, what it destroyed in her, and what it monetized the moment she stopped breathing. Barbara Lamar did not simply fade away. She was consumed by Hollywood systematically, profitably, and with full knowledge of what was happening. To understand how this happened, we must start at the very beginning. Barbara Lamar was not discovered. That word discovered implies someone else did the work. Someone else saw the potential. Someone else extended a hand and pulled her up from obscurity into the light. That is not what happened. That is never what happened with Barbara Lamar. She discovered herself. She built herself. She walked into Hollywood on her own 2 feet and she made them pay attention through sheer, relentless, self-manufactured force of will. She was born Retha Dale Watson in 1896 in Yakima, Washington. Not Beverly Hills. Not New York. Not any of the cities that produced the polished, connected, well-positioned young women who populated the studio rosters of the early 1920s. Yakima, a working class beginning in a working class town with no industry connections, no family money, no safety net of any kind. What she had was intelligence, sharp, restless, and entirely self-directed. What she had was discipline. What she had was the absolute refusal to accept that the life she was born into was the life she was required to keep. She taught herself to write, not in a classroom, not under the supervision of anyone who might have smoothed the edges and drained the originality out of it. She read voraciously, wrote constantly, and developed a voice that was entirely her own, sardonic, romantic, emotionally precise in a way that formal education rarely produces. By her mid-teens, she was writing poetry serious enough to be taken seriously. By her early 20s, she was writing screenplays. Let that sit for a moment. Barbara Lamar did not arrive in Hollywood to be looked at. She arrived to work. The face that Louis B. Mayer would eventually weaponize into a marketing slogan, was almost incidental to her ambitions. She wanted to write. She wanted to create. She wanted to participate in the construction of stories, not merely to decorate them. Hollywood, being Hollywood, looked at her face and made other plans. She began dancing professionally in her teens, performing in Los Angeles venues that required talent and endurance in equal measure. She was arrested twice, before the age of 18, under California's so-called vagrant laws, statutes that were selectively enforced against young women who performed in public without male guardianship. The state of California, in its wisdom, decided that a self-supporting teenage girl earning her living through dance was a social problem requiring intervention. Barbara Lamar decided that the state of California could mind its own business, and she kept working. She married, more than once. The details of her early marriages are complicated and, in the framing of the era, scandalous, which is to say they were the ordinary complications of a young woman navigating a world that offered her very few good options and punished her for choosing the wrong ones. What matters is this: she did not allow any of it to stop her, Not the marriages, not the divorces, not the arrests, not the poverty, not the systemic institutional hostility toward women who refused to stay in their designated lanes. By 1920, she was writing scenarios, early-era screenplays for the film industry. She sold them. She got paid. She built professional relationships on the strength of her craft, not on the strength of anyone's patronage. Douglas Fairbanks, Sr., one of the most powerful men in silent-era Hollywood, recognized her writing ability and hired her. This is not a small thing. Fairbanks was not in the habit of hiring people as favors. He hired competence. And Barbara Lamar was competent in ways that the industry was only beginning to understand. Then the cameras found her face. Her screen debut came in 1920, and the audience reaction was, by every account, immediate and overwhelming. There was something in the way she existed on screen that bypassed the normal process of becoming a star, the slow accumulation of roles, the gradual building of recognition, and landed directly in the consciousness of audiences who had never seen her before. She did not become famous. She arrived famous as if the audience had been waiting for her without knowing it. The roles came quickly after that. The Prisoner of Zenda in 1922, Trifling Women the same year. Thy Name is Woman in 1924. The White Moth, The Heart of a Siren, picture after picture, each one confirming what the first had established, that Barbara Lamar was not a novelty. She was not a beautiful face attached to a mediocre performance. She was a genuine screen presence with genuine technical skill, and the rare ability to make an audience feel something real through the silent medium's most demanding constraint. Pure physical expression. The fan mail arrived by the thousands. The publicity photographs sold in numbers that MGM's accounting department tracked with great satisfaction. Across America, in darkened theaters, working-class women who had never been to Los Angeles and never would go looked at Barbara Lamar on screen and felt, for 2 hours, that the world contained more beauty and more possibility than their daily lives suggested. She gave them that. She made that real for them. And she did it through work, grinding, continuous, physically demanding work that the studio scheduled without mercy and promoted without gratitude. By 1924, she was one of the most recognizable women in American cinema. She had a fan base that studio executives openly envied. She had a son, a boy she adopted and loved with fierce, documented devotion. She had survived everything that had been thrown at her. She had built something real out of nothing, through talent and discipline and the refusal to be defeated. She was 28 years old. She was already sick. And the studio, the machine that had taken everything she built and stamped its own name on it, was already deciding that her schedule for the following year would not slow down. Not for her health, not for her son, not for the simple human recognition that the woman who had made them millions of dollars deserved, at minimum, the basic dignity of medical care. The machine had her, and the machine was not finished with her yet. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer did not make movies. That is not a provocation. That is a precise, accurate description of what MGM actually was in the 1920s. MGM manufactured product. It operated factories. They called them studios, where human beings were processed into commercial assets, their faces and bodies and voices and souls extracted for maximum market value, and then discarded when the extraction became unprofitable. The movies were the output. The humans were the raw material. And Louis B. Mayer, who ran this operation with the unsentimental efficiency of a man who had never once confused sentiment with business, understood the distinction with absolute clarity. Louis B. Mayer was not a monster in the way that popular mythology prefers its villains, operatic, obvious, twirling some metaphorical mustache in a mahogany office. He was something more dangerous than that. He was a pragmatist. He was a man who had built an empire through the ruthless application of a single governing principle. People are resources. Resources exist to be utilized. And the efficient utilization of resources is not cruelty. it is management. He had come from nothing himself. Born in 1884 in what is now Ukraine, raised in poverty in Canada, he had clawed his way into the entertainment industry through sheer commercial instinct and the willingness to do whatever the moment required. He understood hunger. He understood desperation. He understood exactly how much leverage a powerful man holds over a talented person with no alternatives, and he used that understanding, systematically and deliberately, to construct contracts that bound his performers to MGM with a thoroughness that would have impressed a medieval feudal lord. The studio contract system of the 1920s was, by any honest assessment, a form of corporate indenture. When MGM signed an actor, and Barbara Lamar signed with them at the height of her fame, when she had enough leverage to have demanded better terms and was instead presented with documents she did not fully understand by lawyers who worked for the studio, that actor did not retain control of their image, their schedule, their public statements, their physical appearance, their romantic associations, or their professional decisions. MGM owned all of it. The contract said so, in language that had been crafted by studio lawyers over years of practice specifically to ensure that no performer could find a way out. MGM decided which pictures Barbara Lamar made. MGM decided how many pictures she made per year, and the answer always was as many as the market could absorb. MGM decided how she was photographed, what she said to journalists, how her personal life was presented to the public. When her health began to deteriorate visibly, MGM decided what story the newspapers would tell about that deterioration. They decided the story would be overwork, the romantic tragedy of an artist too devoted to her craft, rather than tuberculosis, which was the truth, because tuberculosis carried stigma and overwork carried sympathy, and sympathy sold tickets while stigma did not. Every one of those decisions was made by people in offices who never sat with Barbara Lamar through a coughing fit, who never watched her body diminish, who never had to look her in the eye and tell her that the production schedule would not accommodate her survival. They sent memos instead. They adjusted call times. They moved scenes around the schedule when she was too ill to perform them, and then moved them back when the studio's patience ran out. They sent doctors, studio doctors, doctors who worked for MGM and reported to MGM, and whose primary professional obligation was to MGM's production timeline rather than to their patient's health, to examine her and clear her for work. This was the machine, not a metaphor, an actual operational system with actual human beings making actual decisions that they understood on some level would shorten Barbara Lamar's life. The financial architecture of this system was elegant in the way that all efficient exploitation is elegant. MGM did not pay Barbara Lamar what she was worth. No studio in the 1920s paid its performers what they were worth, because the contract system ensured that performers had no mechanism for establishing their market value independently. What the studio paid was what the studio decided to pay, a figure calculated not by any assessment of the performer's contribution to revenue, but by the minimum amount required to keep the performer working and prevent them from finding a way around the contract. Barbara Lamar's pictures were making MGM significant money. The Prisoner of Zenda alone had performed beyond the studio's projections. Her fan base was enormous, her appeal was consistent, and her name on a picture's promotional materials moved tickets in markets across the country. The studio knew exactly what she was worth to them. They paid her a fraction of it and invested none of it in her continued physical existence. Meanwhile, the working conditions on MGM sets in the mid-1920s were, by any modern standard and by many contemporary ones, dangerous. The early film industry had developed faster than any safety culture could keep pace with. Sets were lit with equipment that generated enormous heat. Shooting schedules ran from early morning to late evening without meaningful breaks. The physical demands on performers, particularly female performers who were expected to maintain specific appearances under those conditions, were extreme. There was no union. There was no regulatory body with genuine enforcement authority. There was no mechanism by which Barbara Lamar could say, "I am too ill to work today," and have that statement mean anything contractually. She said it anyway. The record shows she said it. The record also shows what happened when she said it. The machine kept running. And somewhere in the MGM accounting department, in ledgers that tracked revenue and costs with meticulous precision, Barbara Lamar appeared as a line item, an asset, depreciating, still generating returns, not yet written off. The seeds of what was coming had been planted long before anyone in that building was willing to acknowledge what they were growing. The harvest was approaching, and Barbara Lamar, who had survived everything else life had thrown at her, was running out of time to outrun it. By 1924, Barbara Lamar's tuberculosis was not a secret, not to her doctors, not to the people who worked alongside her on set every day, not to the wardrobe department that dressed a body visibly losing mass with each passing month, not to the makeup artists who worked increasingly harder to construct the illusion of health on a face that health was visibly abandoning. The people who were physically present with Barbara Lamar, the crew members, the directors, the supporting cast, they knew. They could see it. They could hear it in the coughing that punctuated the shooting days. They could measure it in the call sheets that had to be rearranged around her deteriorating stamina. MGM knew too. This is not speculation. This is not inference drawn from circumstantial evidence. MGM employed studio physicians whose explicit function was to monitor the physical condition of contracted performers, not for the performers' benefit, but for the studio's production planning. These physicians examined Barbara Lamar. They filed reports. Those reports went to production executives who read them and made scheduling decisions based on them. The information traveled up the chain. Louis B. Mayer's operation was not so large that a contracted star's progressive physical collapse went unreported to the people at the top. They knew. They scheduled her anyway. In 1924 alone, Barbara Lamar appeared in multiple productions. Thy Name is Woman, The White Moth, The Heart of a Siren, picture after picture, each one requiring the full physical and emotional output of a performer whose body was being systematically destroyed by a disease that demanded, above all other things, rest. Tuberculosis in 1924 was not untreatable. It was not a guaranteed death sentence. The medical consensus of the era was clear. With rest, with nutrition, with reduced physical stress and proper sanatorium care, patients could stabilize, could recover function, could survive. The treatment was not complicated. The treatment was simply incompatible with MGM's production schedule. So MGM chose the production schedule. Let us be forensically precise about what that choice meant in practice. It meant that Barbara Lamar reported to sets in the early morning hours when her body required sleep. It meant she performed under intense artificial lighting that generated heat her compromised respiratory system struggled to tolerate. It meant she executed physically demanding scenes, the emotional extremity that silent film performance required, the full-body expressiveness that the medium demanded in the absence of sound, while her lungs were progressively failing. It meant she maintained the appearance of health, through makeup and costuming and the sheer force of professional discipline, while the reality beneath that appearance deteriorated week by week. Not a single studio physician intervened to halt production. Not a single MGM executive ordered a production pause to allow their contracted performer to receive medical care. Not a single contractual provision existed that would have allowed Barbara Lamar to stop working without financial penalty. This was the trap, not metaphorical, structural, built into the contract she had signed, maintained by the financial penalties that would have fallen on her if she refused to work, enforced by the complete absence of any institutional mechanism that prioritized her survival over MGM's quarterly output. She had a son, a young boy she had adopted and loved with the fierce, documented devotion that every account of her personal life confirms. That son required financial support. The financial support came from the work. The work was killing her. She could not stop the work without losing the income. She could not lose the income without failing her son. MGM did not construct this trap accidentally. The studio contract system was designed precisely to ensure that performers had no exit that did not cost them everything. The publicity machine made the trap invisible to the outside world. While Barbara Lamar deteriorated on set, MGM's publicity department manufactured a parallel narrative for public consumption. She was dedicated. She was tireless. She was the consummate professional who gave everything to her art. The fan magazines, publications that existed in a symbiotic financial relationship with the studios, dependent on studio access and studio advertising revenue, printed what MGM told them to print. They printed the dedication narrative. They printed the tireless professional narrative. They did not print the tuberculosis. The specific financial calculation that MGM made in 1924 and 1925 was never written down in language that would survive legal scrutiny. Institutions that commit acts of lethal negligence rarely annotate them helpfully for future prosecutors. But the calculation is visible in the decisions. Barbara Lamar was still generating revenue. Her pictures were still selling. Her name still moved tickets. The cost of replacing her, finding another performer with her specific combination of established fan base, screen presence, and contractual compliance, was higher in the studio's cold arithmetic than the cost of continuing to use her. So they continued to use her. There was one moment, documented, specific, damning, when the trap became inescapable. In 1925, Barbara Lamar's condition had deteriorated to the point where even the studio's managed narrative was becoming difficult to maintain. She was visibly unwell. The weight loss was no longer concealable through costuming alone. The coughing was no longer something that could be edited around in production. A competent physician, one without a contractual obligation to MGM's timeline, would have admitted her to a sanatorium immediately and kept her there for months. MGM's response was to announce that she was suffering from exhaustion and would rest briefly before returning to work. The rest period was brief. The return to work was scheduled before her condition had improved. The machine did not pause for Barbara Lamar's survival because the machine had never been designed with Barbara Lamar's survival as a variable worth protecting. She walked back onto the set because the trap left her no alternative, because the contract bound her, because her son needed the income, because MGM's publicity apparatus had so thoroughly controlled the public narrative that even the people who loved her did not fully understand what was happening to her body behind the carefully maintained facade of professional dedication. The trap was perfect. It had been built over years, by lawyers and executives and contract language and publicity decisions, and it had closed around Barbara Lamar so gradually and so completely that by the time its full dimensions were visible, escape was no longer possible. What came next was not inevitable in the way that fate is inevitable. It was inevitable in the way that a locked room with no oxygen is inevitable. Someone had turned the key. Someone had removed the oxygen. And they had done it deliberately, methodically, and with full knowledge of what a locked room without oxygen eventually produces. In the final months of 1925, Barbara Lamar weighed less than 90 pounds. Let that number exist in silence for a moment before we continue. 90 pounds. A grown woman. A woman who had, at the height of her career, possessed the kind of physical vitality that translated through the silent screen's unforgiving lens as something almost supernatural. A presence, an energy, a quality of being fully, completely alive that audiences felt in their chests without being able to name it. That woman, in the final months of 1925, weighed less than 90 pounds. Her body had been consuming itself for months. the tuberculosis progressing through stages that her physicians understood and documented and reported to a studio that received those reports and continued scheduling her for work. She was still working in late 1925. Read that sentence again. She was still working, not because she was unaware of her condition, not because she was in denial about what was happening to her body. Barbara Lamar was an intelligent woman, a writer, an observer, a person of exceptional perceptual clarity, and she understood with devastating precision exactly what tuberculosis in its advanced stages meant. She understood what the weight loss meant. She understood what the increasing respiratory distress meant. She understood, on some level, that she almost certainly never articulated publicly, because articulating it would have meant confronting what the studio intended to do about it, that she was dying. She worked anyway, because the trap left her no other option. The set photographs from her final productions are, a century later, almost unbearable to look at. The camera, that instrument that had always loved her face with such fidelity, could not lie about what was happening to her body. The studio photographers did their best. The lighting was carefully managed. The angles were chosen to conceal rather than reveal. The makeup was applied by professionals who understood their task was no longer to enhance her beauty, but to reconstruct the illusion of health over a face that health had largely vacated. And still, through all of it, through every technical intervention the studio's considerable resources could deploy, she looks like a woman who is dying, because she was a woman who was dying. The crew members who worked with her in those final months left accounts, some recorded at the time, others surfacing years and decades later, that are consistent in their detail and consistent in their emotional register. They describe a woman of extraordinary professional discipline who arrived on set, performed what was required of her, and concealed the extent of her suffering with a determination that her colleagues recognized as both heroic and heartbreaking. They describe a woman who coughed between takes and composed herself before the camera rolled, who sat between setups with a stillness that was not rest but conservation, the careful husbanding of energy that the severely ill learn because they have no energy to waste. They describe also the absence of anyone from MGM's executive structure on those sets, not Louis B. Mayer, not the production executives who had reviewed the physicians' reports and made the scheduling decisions. Not a single person with the authority to say, "Stop, this is enough. This woman goes to a sanatorium today and the production waits." The people with authority were in their offices. The people without authority, the crew, the directors, the fellow performers, watched Barbara Lamar hold herself together through sheer force of will, and felt the helplessness of people who could see exactly what was happening and had no institutional power to stop it. This is where we must pause and name the heroes, because there were heroes, and history has not been sufficiently attentive to them. There were crew members who covered for her, who adjusted schedules quietly, without studio authorization, to give her additional recovery time between physically demanding sequences, who brought her food on set, because Barbara Lamar, at under 90 pounds, required nutrition that her own body could no longer prompt her to seek, and sat with her between setups and treated her with the basic human dignity that the institution employing them both had explicitly declined to provide. There were fellow performers who adjusted their own performances in scenes with her, subtly, without drawing attention to what they were doing, to reduce the physical demands on a woman they could see was failing, who stood closer than the blocking required so she could lean against them without the camera catching it, who held her hand between takes in the way that people hold the hands of the dying when they have no other tool available. These people had no power. They had only decency, and decency in the face of MGM's institutional machinery was not enough to save Barbara Lamar's life. But it mattered. It matters now, a century later, that these people existed, that not everyone on those sets had decided that a human being's survival was less important than a production schedule. Louis B. Mayer had made that decision. His executives had made that decision. The studio physicians who cleared her for work had made that decision. The grip who brought her food between setups had not. By December 1925, the performance was no longer sustainable. The weight loss had progressed beyond what any technical intervention could conceal. The respiratory distress was affecting her ability to complete scenes. The physical collapse that the studio had been managing around, scheduling around, publicizing around, was no longer manageable. Barbara Lamar was admitted, finally, at last, far too late, to a care facility. She was 29 years old. She weighed under 90 pounds. The tuberculosis that had been progressing untreated through months of continued studio work had advanced to a stage that the medical resources of 1925, which could have stabilized an earlier presentation of the disease, could no longer reverse. On January 30, 1926, Barbara Lamar died. Not on a set, not in a studio, not in the professionally managed, carefully lit, contractually obligated performance space that MGM had made her primary habitat for the last years of her life. She died in a care facility in a bed with the people who actually loved her, not the studio, not the executives, not Louis B. Mayer present. Her son was 4 years old. In the offices of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer the day she died, people were already calculating what came next. Not what they owed her, not what they had taken from her, what they could still extract. The true horror is not what happened in that care facility on January 30, 1926. The true horror is what happened in those offices while it was happening. Barbara Lamar was not yet cold when MGM activated its publicity machine, not metaphorically. The studio's public relations apparatus, a sophisticated, well-funded, professionally staffed operation that had spent years managing Barbara Lamar's image for commercial purposes, pivoted to managing her death for commercial purposes, with a speed that tells you everything you need to know about how MGM understood the relationship between human beings and institutional utility. She had been an asset in life. In death, handled correctly, she could remain an asset. The machine that had consumed her did not stop running when she stopped breathing. It simply found a new product to process. The cover-up operated in 3 distinct layers. Each one was more calculated than the last. Each one was more damaging than the last. And each one was executed with the practiced efficiency of an institution that had done this before and expected to do it again. Layer 1. They blamed the victim. The official MGM narrative, distributed to newspapers, fan magazines, and wire services within hours of Barbara Lamar's death, was a masterpiece of strategic misdirection. She had died, the studio told the world, of overwork, of exhaustion, of the tragically unsustainable demands she had placed upon herself in service of her art. She had burned too brightly. She had given too much. She had loved Hollywood with a devotion that Hollywood, regrettably, could not protect her from. Every word of this narrative was constructed to locate the agency for her death inside Barbara Lamar herself, in her choices, her dedication, her inability to moderate her own professional passion, and nowhere near the studio that had scheduled her through the advanced stages of a fatal illness without providing medical intervention. The fan magazines printed it without question. Photoplay, Motion Picture, Screenland. Publications that depended on MGM for access, for advertising revenue, for the continued cooperation that made their business model viable. These publications printed the overwork narrative because printing the tuberculosis narrative would have cost them the studio relationship they could not afford to lose. The American public, which had loved Barbara Lamar with genuine devotion, read that she had died of exhaustion and mourned accordingly. They mourned a woman who had loved her work too much. They did not know they should have been mourning a woman who had been worked to death by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The word tuberculosis appeared in almost none of the immediate coverage. MGM had not prohibited its use. Prohibition would have been obvious, would have created questions. Instead, the studio simply provided such a complete and emotionally satisfying alternative narrative that journalists had no commercial incentive to dig beneath it. The Overwork story was romantic. It was tragic. It sold copies. The tuberculosis story was ugly and institutional and implicated powerful people. In 1926, American entertainment journalism was not in the business of implicating powerful people. Layer 2. They corrupted and bypassed the authorities. The relationship between MGM and the Los Angeles municipal authorities in the 1920s was not a relationship between an institution and its regulators. It was a relationship between a patron and its dependents. MGM was one of the largest employers in Los Angeles County. Its economic footprint touched virtually every aspect of the city's commercial life. The politicians who governed Los Angeles, the officials who administered its regulatory functions, the physicians who held official positions, these people existed in a civic ecosystem that MGM's money had substantially constructed. There was no serious official inquiry into Barbara Lamar's death. There was no investigation into the studio's decision to continue scheduling a terminally ill performer. There was no examination of the studio physicians who had cleared her for work through the progressive stages of her tuberculosis. There was no regulatory body that demanded to see the production schedules alongside the medical reports and asked, in the pointed language that the situation required, why those two documents contained such a catastrophic contradiction. The death certificate recorded the cause of death. It did not record the institutional decisions that had made that cause of death inevitable. It did not name Louis B. Mayer. It did not name MGM. It named a disease, as if the disease had operated independently of the conditions the studio had created and maintained, as if tuberculosis had sought Barbara Lamar out specifically and destroyed her without any assistance from the people who had kept her working through its progression. The coroner's office in Los Angeles in 1926 was not staffed by people who investigated the deaths of Hollywood performers with adversarial rigor. It was staffed by people who lived in a city that MGM had helped build and who understood, with the clarity that economic dependence produces, where the limits of official curiosity were located. The limits were located well short of Louis B. Mayer's office. Layer 3. They financially exploited the death. Before Barbara Lamar was buried, MGM had already identified the commercial opportunities her death created. The pictures she had completed before her collapse went into accelerated release. The studio's marketing department understood, with the cold, precise instinct that distinguished MGM's commercial operation, that Barbara Lamar's death had made her more famous than she had been in the final months of her illness. Death had restored the publicity. Death had returned her to the front pages. Death had reminded the American public of what they had loved about her, and that reminder translated directly into ticket sales for the pictures sitting in MGM's release pipeline. They released them. They promoted them aggressively. They used her death, the tragedy, the loss, the public grief, as a marketing tool for products she had made while dying, products whose production had contributed to the conditions that killed her. The promotional materials did not mention this connection. They mentioned her beauty. They mentioned her talent. They mentioned, carefully and strategically, the tragedy of her early death, because tragedy, in MGM's commercial calculation, was not a reason to pause. It was a reason to advertise. And then there was the son. Barbara Lamar's adopted boy, 4 years old, now without a mother, became a publicity instrument within weeks of her death. The fan magazines that had printed the Overwork narrative without question now printed photographs of the child. They printed stories about his loss. They printed, with the sentimental excess that the era's entertainment press specialized in, meditations on the tragedy of a beautiful mother taken too soon from a child who needed her. MGM did not discourage this coverage. MGM facilitated it. The child's grief was content. The child's orphanhood was a story that kept Barbara Lamar's name in circulation, kept her pictures in public conversation, and cost the studio nothing. Because the child's welfare was not MGM's financial responsibility, and the coverage that used his image to sell newspapers and magazines generated no revenue that reached him. Barbara Lamar had worked herself to death in part to provide for that child. The studio that had made that work inescapable now used the child's resulting motherlessness as promotional material. This is what the cover-up looked like. Not a single dramatic act of concealment. 3 layers of calculated management, blame redistribution, regulatory neutralization, and commercial exploitation, executed with the smooth, practiced efficiency of an institution that had reduced human tragedy to a workflow. Louis B. Mayer stood at her graveside with flowers. The flowers cost him nothing. The cover-up cost Barbara Lamar everything she had left. Barbara Lamar was not the first. This is the fact that the studio system's carefully managed historical narrative most desperately needed to bury. Because the moment you understand that Barbara Lamar was not an isolated tragedy, the moment you recognize her death as one data point in a pattern, rather than one unfortunate outcome in an otherwise functional system, the entire apparatus of excuse and misdirection that MGM constructed around her death collapses completely. She was not the first performer the studio system worked past the point of human endurance. She was not the first contracted artist whose medical needs were subordinated to a production schedule. She was not the first person whose body was treated as a depreciating asset to be utilized, until utilization was no longer commercially viable. The silent era of Hollywood produced these tragedies with the regularity of an industry that had made a structural decision, conscious, calculated, and never formally acknowledged, that the cost of human welfare was not a cost worth bearing. 0 reforms followed Barbara Lamar's death. Not one new contractual provision requiring studios to provide genuine medical care to contracted performers. Not one regulatory change mandating that production schedules accommodate documented illness. Not one industry-wide standard establishing that a performer's physician, a physician with actual obligation to the patient rather than to the studio's timeline, held authority over whether a sick performer reported to set. Not one mechanism by which Barbara Lamar's specific situation, a terminally ill woman contractually bound to continue working, could have been prevented from recurring. Nothing changed, because nothing was designed to change. To understand why nothing changed, you need to understand the corporate arithmetic that governed every decision MGM made about its contracted performers. This arithmetic was never written on a whiteboard in an executive meeting. It did not need to be. It was embedded in the structure of the institution itself, in the financial incentives that shaped every scheduling decision and every contract negotiation and every conversation between a studio physician and a production executive. The arithmetic worked like this. A contracted performer like Barbara Lamar generated revenue that the studio could calculate with reasonable precision. Box office returns, ancillary merchandise, the competitive advantage of having a performer with her specific fan base under exclusive contract rather than available to rival studios. Against this revenue, the studio weighed costs, the cost of production, the cost of marketing, the cost of the performer's salary, always kept as low as the contract system could make it. And when the performer became ill, the cost of the choice the studio faced. Option 1. Pause production, provide genuine medical care, allow the performer to recover. This option carried a certain cost, the production delay, the lost revenue from pictures not made during the recovery period, the competitive disadvantage of having a major contracted performer off the market. It also carried a potential benefit. A performer who recovered could continue generating revenue for years, but recovery was not guaranteed. And the studio, applying its arithmetic, calculated the uncertain future value of a recovered performer against the certain present cost of stopping production. Option 2. Continue production, manage the illness through publicity, extract remaining value from the performer's diminishing capacity. This option carried no immediate cost. The schedule continued, the pictures got made, the revenue continued to flow. The long-term cost, the performer's death, the loss of future revenue from that performer, was real but deferred, and deferred costs in corporate arithmetic are discounted costs. $1 of lost future revenue is worth less than $1 of present revenue. A human life that will end in 6 months is worth less, to a studio's financial model, than 6 months of continued production. MGM chose option 2, not because the people who made the choice were uniquely evil, because the system was designed to make option 2 the rational choice, because no regulatory framework imposed a cost on option 2 that outweighed its financial benefits, because no legal structure held studios accountable for the deaths of performers they had worked past the point of survival, because the performers themselves had no union, no collective bargaining mechanism, no institutional counterweight to the studio's financial logic. The studio system of the 1920s was a machine for converting human beings into revenue, and it was optimized for that conversion with a thoroughness that left no room for the kind of inefficiency that keeping people alive sometimes requires. Barbara Lamar was 29 years old when this machine finished with her. Olive Thomas had been 25 when her death exposed the studio system's deliberate concealment of the drug culture it had created and profited from. Alma Rubens would follow, another MGM performer, another story of addiction enabled and exploited by the studio system, another death that generated publicity without generating reform. The pattern was not subtle. The pattern was not hidden. The pattern was visible to anyone who chose to look at the evidence rather than the studio's managed narrative. The trade press chose not to look. The fan magazines chose not to look. The regulatory bodies that might have looked were staffed by people who had already made their peace with MGM's economic dominance of the civic landscape. And the American public, which loved these performers, which mourned them genuinely and deeply, was never given the information it would have needed to direct that grief toward the institution responsible for the loss. This is the ideological core of what happened to Barbara Lamar. It was not a story about one woman's tragedy. It was a story about an industry's deliberate, sustained, institutionally protected decision to treat human beings as consumable resources, to build a system in which the question was never whether a performer's health mattered, but how long the studio could continue profiting from a performer before the health question became impossible to manage. The answer, in Barbara Lamar's case, was approximately 2 years. 2 years from the point at which her tuberculosis was known to the studio to the point at which her death became unavoidable. 2 years during which MGM made pictures, generated revenue, managed publicity, and produced not one internal document that seriously engaged with the question of whether the woman generating that revenue would survive the process. 2 years, multiple pictures, millions of dollars in revenue, 1 death, 0 reforms, 0 accountability, 0 apology. The machine did not mourn Barbara Lamar. The machine processed her death exactly as it had processed her life, as raw material, to be converted into product at the lowest possible cost, with the maximum possible efficiency. Louis B. Mayer understood this. His executives understood this. The lawyers who drafted the contracts understood this. The studio physicians who cleared sick performers for work understood this. They understood it, and they built it, and they maintained it. And when Barbara Lamar died inside it, they stood at her graveside and performed grief for the cameras and went back to their offices and changed absolutely nothing. Because changing something would have cost money. And money, in MGM's arithmetic, was always worth more than the people who made it for them. Louis B. Mayer stood at her graveside with flowers in his hand. We return to this image because this image is the truth of everything. Not the pictures she made, not the contracts she signed, Not the publicity materials or the fan magazine covers or the carefully managed narratives that MGM constructed around her life and her death and the child she left behind. This image, this specific documented, photographed moment, a powerful man standing over the grave of a woman his institution destroyed, holding flowers, performing grief, surrounded by cameras that recorded the performance for a public that deserved the truth and received theater instead. The flowers were fresh. They would have cost someone a phone call, a studio account number, a delivery arrangement made by an assistant who handled such things. They would have cost Louis B. Mayer nothing, not money, not thought, not the weight of genuine feeling. They were props. Expensive, fragrant, carefully chosen props in the final scene of a production that MGM had been managing since the moment Barbara Lamar's death became commercially inevitable. She was 29 years old. Slow down. Sit with that number. 29 years old. In 1926, 29 was not the beginning of middle age. It was the height of a life, the point at which everything built in youth begins to compound, begins to pay returns, begins to become the foundation of something that lasts. At 29, Barbara Lamar had already done things that most people never do in a full lifetime. She had written. She had performed. She had conquered an industry built to exclude people like her. She had adopted a child and loved him with the fierce, specific devotion of a woman who understood what it meant to need someone in your corner. She had done all of that before 29. What she would have done after 29, what pictures she would have made, what she would have written, what the sound era that was only 2 years away would have revealed about a talent that had only ever been partially expressed through the silent medium's constraints. That is the loss that MGM's corporate arithmetic never calculated. Not because it was incalculable, but because it was irrelevant to the calculation they were actually running. The studio did not factor in what Barbara Lamar might have become. They factored in what she could still produce before she stopped being able to produce anything. The answer was, enough. She could still produce enough, so they kept her working. Her son attended the funeral. He was 4 years old. He stood in the particular bewilderment of a 4-year-old at a funeral, old enough to understand that something enormous and irreversible had happened, too young to process the specific shape of the loss he was standing inside. The cameras recorded him too. The fan magazines printed the photographs. The American public, which had loved his mother with genuine devotion, looked at those photographs and felt the particular grief that a child's loss produces, the uncomplicated, unmediated human response to innocence encountering devastation. MGM had not provided for that child. The studio that had bound his mother contractually, that had scheduled her through the progressive stages of her fatal illness, that had extracted her labor until extraction was no longer physically possible. That studio had not constructed any financial provision for the child she had worked herself to death to support. The photographs of his grief appeared in publications that generated revenue. None of that revenue reached him. He was content. He was not a dependent. He was a prop in the final act of MGM's Barbara Lamar management strategy, useful for exactly as long as his image generated sympathetic coverage and no longer. The powerful attended her funeral with their flowers and their performed grief and their careful positioning in the photographs. They said the things that powerful people say at the funerals of people, their power destroyed, the words about talent, about tragedy, about the cruel randomness of fate that takes the brilliant ones too soon. They said these things in the full knowledge that fate had not taken Barbara Lamar. They had taken Barbara Lamar. Through contracts and schedules and studio physicians and publicity campaigns, and the cold, precise, institutional decision to keep her working until her body made working impossible. They said the words anyway, because the words were for the cameras, and the cameras were for the public, and the public, even in its grief, was an audience, a market, a demographic, a source of ticket revenue, and MGM had never, not once in its institutional history, allowed genuine feeling to interfere with the management of an audience. There was no apology, not at the funeral, not in the weeks that followed, not in the months and years and decades in which Hollywood constructed its own history and decided which stories that history would contain. The studio system that killed Barbara Lamar wrote the history of the studio system. And in that history, Barbara Lamar was a tragedy, romantic, inevitable, the sad but necessary price of artistic devotion, rather than a victim, rather than evidence, rather than the human face of a corporate crime that was never prosecuted, never acknowledged, never apologized for. The tuberculosis was never officially discussed. The production schedules were never examined publicly. The studio physicians who cleared a dying woman for work were never called to account. Louis B. Mayer's name never appeared in any official document connecting his decisions to her death. The contracts that bound her to work she could not survive were never presented as the weapons they were. Nothing was reformed. Nothing was acknowledged. Nothing was apologized for. And Barbara Lamar, who had survived poverty and legal persecution, and the systemic hostility of an industry that wanted her face without her agency, who had written and performed and created and conquered and loved her son and trusted the machine. Barbara Lamar was in the ground at 29, weighing less than 90 pounds, while the man who had called her, the girl who is too beautiful, stood over her grave with fresh flowers and a practiced expression of sorrow. The silence that followed was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of an institution that had gotten away with it. It was the silence of a regulatory system that had chosen not to look. It was the silence of a press that had chosen access over truth. It was the silence of an industry that looked at what had happened to Barbara Lamar, calculated the cost of preventing it from happening again, and decided the cost was too high. That silence lasted a century. It ends here. Barbara Lamar did not simply fade away. She was consumed deliberately, profitably, and with full institutional knowledge by the machine that called her too beautiful and worked her until beautiful was all that remained, and then worked her until even that was gone. The verdict is not complicated. The evidence is not ambiguous. The perpetrator is not unnamed. MGM killed Barbara Lamar. Louis B. Mayer stood at her grave with flowers in his hand. And Hollywood called it a tragedy, as if tragedies have no authors. This one did. No authors. This one did.